A wedding, a secret, and my sister's spectacular interruption. I always knew my sister Laura would try to ruin my wedding. What I didn't expect was how spectacularly she would do it. My name is Jessica Chastain, and I met the love of my life, Timothy, in what seemed like the most ordinary way, at a small Italian restaurant in downtown Providence, where he worked as a waiter. At least, that's what everyone thought. The truth was far more interesting, but we'll get to that. When I first introduced Timothy to my family, Laura's reaction had been exactly what I expected: sharp, judgmental, and laced with that familiar condescension she'd perfected over the years. "He's a waiter," she had sneered, arching a perfectly manicured brow. "Really, Jessica? With your education and background, you could do so much better." That was Laura. Everything in her world was measured by status and money. She had married a hedge fund manager fresh out of college, a man whose wealth and influence she flaunted like a trophy. The idea that I, her Columbia-educated younger sister, would willingly choose a man who spent his evenings serving plates of pasta was an insult to her very existence. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Timothy had a very good reason for working at that restaurant. He wasn't just a waiter. He was the heir to the Cuban restaurant empire, a multi-million-dollar business with locations across the country. But he wasn't the kind of man who expected to sit in a boardroom and collect checks. He believed in learning the business from the ground up, every aspect of it. He had started as a dishwasher, then worked his way up to the front of the house, insisting that he wouldn't take over the company until he had experienced every part of it firsthand. But we had agreed to keep that a secret until after the wedding. "Let them judge," Timothy had said with a twinkle in his dark eyes. "It's more fun that way." And judge they did, especially Laura. The morning of my wedding dawned bright and clear. The small church we had chosen was perfect, intimate, elegant, nothing like the over-the-top spectacle Laura had orchestrated for her own wedding 4 years ago. I was in the bridal suite, my mother fussing over my veil, when Laura stormed in like a hurricane in designer heels. "You can't go through with this," she declared, standing in the doorway as if she were about to stage an intervention. She was still wearing her expensive dress like armor, her face a mixture of desperation and fury. I sighed, already exhausted. "Laura, not today. Do you even know what people are saying?" she pressed on, her voice rising. "That you've lost your mind. That you're throwing your life away for some waiter." My mother, who had grown increasingly weary of Laura's dramatics over the past few months, finally had enough. "The only person saying that is you, Laura," she said, her tone firm. Laura turned to her, exasperated.
"Mom."
"He probably just wants her money. He's using her." I let out a short laugh. If only she knew. I could have shut her down right then and there, could have told her that Timothy was worth more money than her precious hedge fund husband and that his family's business brought in revenue numbers that would make her head spin. But I didn't. Because I didn't need to. Timothy loved me. And I loved him. And in just a few short hours, nothing Laura said would matter anymore. The wedding drama no one would ever forget. I couldn't help but laugh. The idea that Timothy was after my money, when my modest teacher's salary was nothing compared to his hidden billions, was almost comical. But Laura didn't take my laughter as amusement. She saw it as defiance. "Fine," she snapped, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her designer clutch. "Ruin your life, but don't come crying to me when you're living in some cramped apartment above a restaurant." Oh, if only she knew. Timothy and I had already picked out a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. And our honeymoon? A private island, complete with white sand beaches and a villa straight out of a billionaire's dream. But I held my tongue. We had made an agreement. The truth would come out in its own time. And that time was coming soon. A wedding to remember. The ceremony started beautifully. Timothy stood at the altar, looking impossibly handsome in his tailored suit, one Laura had probably assumed was a cheap rental. Our closest friends and family filled the pews, though notably fewer on my side, thanks to Laura's relentless campaign to convince relatives my wedding wasn't worth attending. Then came the moment that would be talked about for years. If anyone knows any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, Speak now or forever hold your peace. A sharp scrape of a chair against the floor. A collective intake of breath. Laura stood up. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice echoing through the church like a battle cry. "Jessica, you're making a huge mistake. You're better than this. You're marrying a waiter, for God's sake. How pathetic can you be?" Silence. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't tremble. I simply looked at Timothy, who gave my fingers a reassuring squeeze. I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "Should we tell her?" he whispered. I shook my head ever so slightly. "Not yet." Laura wasn't done. She stormed toward the altar, her expensive heels clicking against the stone floor like a judge delivering a sentence. "Everyone here knows this is a joke. Jessica, you were supposed to be the smart one, the successful one. And now look at you, throwing it all away on some server." "Laura," our father warned from the front pew, his voice tight with embarrassment. She ignored him. "When this all falls apart, don't expect any sympathy from me," she snapped, glaring at me as if she could force me to change my mind by sheer willpower. "You've made your bed, probably a very cheap one. Now lie in it." With that final shot, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the church, her designer dress billowing behind her. For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. Then, the minister cleared his throat awkwardly. "Shall we continue?" I looked up at Timothy, saw the love and amusement dancing in his eyes, and smiled. "Yes," I said firmly. "Let's continue." And we did. The rest of the ceremony was perfect, made even better by Laura's absence. As we exchanged rings, I couldn't help but think about what was coming next. Act 2. The grand reveal. The reception was set to take place at one of Timothy's family's most exclusive restaurants, one that had been mysteriously closed to the public for the day. Laura had no idea her very public tantrum was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. I couldn't wait to see her face when she realized just how wrong she'd been about everything. But first, we had to get through the photos and the drive to the reception. Timothy helped me into the vintage Rolls-Royce, one that wasn't rented as Laura would assume, but actually part of his personal collection. As our guests showered us with rice and cheered, he leaned in close, his lips brushing against my ear. "Ready for Act 2? He murmured. I smiled. "Oh, I've been waiting for this part all day." I smiled, thinking about the scene that was about to unfold at the reception. "More than ready. Do you think she'll show up?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Timothy chuckled, his confidence unwavering. "Oh, she'll show up. People like Laura can't resist a chance to feel superior. She'll come just to witness what she assumes will be a cheap, embarrassing disaster of a reception." He was right, of course. Laura might have stormed out of the ceremony in dramatic fashion, but there was no way she'd miss the opportunity to pick apart every detail of our wedding celebration. She had no idea she was walking straight into a moment that would leave her absolutely speechless. As we drove toward the reception, I reflected on how perfectly everything had played out. Laura's outburst, while hurtful, had only made what was coming even sweeter. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about letting someone's own arrogance pave the way for their humiliation. Ahead of us, the Cuban, the flagship restaurant of Timothy's family empire, loomed in all its grandeur. The elegant facade, the prime location, the exclusivity. This was a place that catered to the elite. A place where celebrities, dignitaries, and billionaires dined in privacy. And today, it was the venue for a wedding reception that would change my family's dynamic forever. Timothy squeezed my hand as we pulled up to the entrance. "Here we go," he said, stepping out of the vintage Rolls-Royce and turning back to help me. "Ready to show your sister who she just humiliated in front of everyone?" I smoothed my dress and took his arm, my pulse steady. "Let's give her a show she'll never forget." The massive doors of the Cuban swung open, revealing an interior dripping in opulence. The warm glow of crystal chandeliers shimmered off the polished marble floors. Hand-painted murals lined the towering walls, depicting scenes from old-world Italy. White-gloved servers moved gracefully through the crowd, offering trays of champagne, The kind that costs more per bottle than what most people assumed Timothy made in a month. A collective gasp rippled through our arriving guests. This must be a mistake, I overheard someone whisper. How could they afford this place? And then, right on cue, Laura arrived. She was fashionably late, of course. Likely expecting to walk into a budget banquet hall with plastic centerpieces and buffet trays. Instead, she stepped into the Cuban and froze. Her perfectly made-up face twisted in confusion as she scanned the room. There's been a mix-up, she declared loudly, approaching me with suspicion. This is the Cuban. They don't do wedding receptions. Ever. Timothy appeared at my side, his expression unreadable but his eyes full of quiet amusement. They made an exception, he said smoothly. For family. Laura barely had time to process those words before an imposing figure emerged from the crowd. Mark Cuban, the patriarch of the Cuban restaurant empire. A legend in the industry. A man so notoriously private that seeing him in public was almost unheard of. And yet, here he was, walking straight toward us. Laura's eyes widened as the elderly man reached Timothy and pulled him into a warm embrace. My grandson, Mark said, his voice rich with pride. Finally married to his beautiful Jessica. Silence. Complete. Absolute. Silence. Laura's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. Gee, grandson, she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark turned to her, his sharp eyes sizing her up. You must be the sister who caused such a scene at the church, he said, his tone pleasant but edged with something unmistakable. Tell me, what was it you called my grandson? He paused, pretending to think. Yes. Some server, wasn't it? Laura went pale. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The realization hit her like a freight train. Timothy wasn't just some waiter. He was the heir to one of the most powerful restaurant empires in the country. The Cuban group owned hundreds of high-end establishments across the globe, as well as luxury hotels, vineyards, and prime real estate. And she had just publicly embarrassed herself in front of all of them. I stood there, watching it all unfold, feeling no need to say a single word. Because at that moment, Laura finally understood just how wrong she had been. And there was no sweeter victory than that. I didn't know, Laura stammered, her face pale. Mark raised an eyebrow and spoke calmly. Maybe next time, you'll remember that true class isn't about what someone does for a living, it's about how they treat others. Timothy squeezed my hand as Laura stood there, frozen in embarrassment. Around us, guests began whispering as they pieced everything together. The simple wedding ceremony followed by this grand reception, the so-called waiter, who was actually the heir to a restaurant empire. Laura finally found her voice. Why didn't you tell me? She demanded, her tone a mix of anger and disbelief. You let me believe. You let me make a fool of myself. I met her eyes, my voice calm but firm. Would it have mattered? Would you have treated Timothy differently if you had known who he really was? She didn't answer. That's exactly why we didn't tell anyone, I continued. We wanted to know who our real friends were. Laura's face twisted with frustration. But I'm your sister. Yes, I said, holding my ground. Which makes your behavior even worse. You couldn't even be happy for me unless you approved of my choices, based on social status. Mark cleared his throat. If you'd like to leave, no one would blame you. You've already provided enough entertainment for one day. Laura's face turned deep red. She glanced around the room, realizing that everyone was watching her. The same people who had witnessed her dramatic outburst at the church were now seeing her embarrassment unfold in real time. She lowered her gaze. I should go, she muttered. Then, to everyone's surprise, Timothy spoke up. Stay. All eyes turned to him. Stay, enjoy the reception, he said sincerely. Think of it as a chance to start over. To see people for who they are, not what they own or what they do for a living. I looked at my husband with pride. Even after everything Laura had done, he was still showing more kindness and grace than she ever had. Laura hesitated, looking down at the shattered glass at her feet. Then slowly she nodded. I'd like that. And I owe you both an apology. Yes, you do, Mark agreed with a small smirk. But perhaps they can wait until after the first dance. I believe my grandson and his bride have waited long enough to celebrate properly. Timothy took my hand and led me to the dance floor, and as we moved together beneath the sparkling chandeliers, I caught glimpses of Laura standing off to the side, alone. She wasn't sulking, but she was thinking, probably trying to calculate just how many apologies it would take before she could start bragging about her new connection to the Cuban family. Timothy leaned in, his breath warm against my ear. She'll never change completely. No, I agreed, smiling. But maybe next time, she'll think twice before judging someone based on their job. The reception carried on like something out of a fairy tale. Course after course of Cuban family specialties were served, paired with wine from their private reserve. Guests were captivated as Mark shared stories of how Timothy had worked his way up, insisting on starting at the bottom. He didn't want special treatment, Mark explained. Most rich kids want to jump straight into the corporate office. Not my grandson. He wanted to earn his place. I squeezed Timothy's hand under the table, filled with love and pride. He had never needed a title or wealth to prove his worth. And now neither did I. I watched Laura's face as she finally realized just how wrong she had been. The waiter she had dismissed so easily had more work ethic and humility than her wealthy hedge fund husband ever had. As the night went on, I noticed her trying to approach us several times, probably to apologize or do some damage control. But each time, someone else would step in, wanting to share a story, offer congratulations, or simply enjoy the night with us. Laura's social punishment would last a little longer. After all, she had spent months making me feel small. A few hours of humility wouldn't kill her. Besides, we had other things to focus on, like the honeymoon villa waiting for us on the Cuban family's private island. But that was a surprise for another day. For now, I was happy to dance with my husband, surrounded by people who loved us for who we were, not what we owned. And if my sister learned something from all of this, well, that was just icing on our very expensive wedding cake. 1 year later, life settled into a new rhythm. Timothy and I moved into our penthouse overlooking Providence Harbor. I continued teaching, while he took on more responsibilities within the Cuban group. We kept things simple just as we always had. But Laura struggled with our new dynamic. You could at least let me host a proper housewarming, she complained one afternoon, looking around at our minimalist decor. This place deserves to be shown off. That's exactly why we don't show it off, I replied. Some things are better kept private. She didn't understand. For the past year, she had been trying to rebuild her reputation, dropping the Cuban name whenever possible. Her social media was suddenly full of posts about my sister and her husband's amazing restaurants and family dinners at the Cuban. Timothy found it amusing. At least she's promoting the business, he'd say with a shrug. But everything changed when Laura's perfect world fell apart. Her hedge fund husband, John, got caught in a massive scandal, insider trading, fraud, the works. Suddenly, the wealth she had flaunted over everyone was gone, frozen by federal investigators. Late one night, she showed up at our door. Her mascara was streaked down her face, her expensive designer coat wrinkled from what looked like hours of crying. "They're taking everything," she sobbed. "The house, the cars. John's facing jail time. I don't know what to do." I led her into the living room, where Timothy was working on his laptop. He looked up, concern crossing his face. Laura swallowed hard, her voice shaky. "I need help." The words clearly hurt her pride. I don't know how to start over." Timothy and I exchanged glances. This was it. Would we help the sister who had tried to ruin our wedding? The same sister who had only accepted us after discovering our wealth? Timothy sighed and leaned back in his chair. "There's an apartment," he said finally, "above one of our smaller restaurants in Stevenage. It's nothing fancy, but it's a start." Laura's eyes widened. "You do that? After how I treated you?" Timothy nodded. "On one condition, a lesson in hard work." I looked at Laura and said, "You'll work in the restaurant. Learn the business from the ground up, just like Timothy did. You'll wait tables." Her eyes widened in horror. Timothy nodded. among other things. You'll wash dishes, bus tables, learn to cook. You need to understand what it means to truly earn your way. Laura was silent for a long time. I could see her struggling with her pride, wrestling with the idea of doing the kind of work she had always looked down on. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and nodded. Okay, I'll do it. But will you help me? Show me how. That was the moment I knew my sister might actually change. 7 months of transformation. The next few months were tough. Laura moved into the small apartment, trading her designer clothes for work uniforms and practical shoes. She cried the first time she had to clean a bathroom. She broke 4 plates her first night serving. She burned herself twice learning to cook. But she didn't quit. I watched as she slowly transformed from someone who looked down on service workers to someone who defended them. She started leaving bigger tips when she ate out. She called out rude customers who mistreated staff. She finally understood the hard work behind a job she once dismissed. 7 months into her new life, I went to visit her at work. She was at the pass, expediting orders, her hair tied back, completely focused. No makeup, no pretense, just honest work. Timothy appeared beside me, watching her with a small smile. She's doing well, he said. The staff actually likes her now. Do you think she's learned her lesson? I asked. Timothy chuckled. I think she's learned several. Want to tell her the other news? I nodded, waiting until her shift ended. The biggest surprise yet. Laura joined us at a corner table, exhausted but somehow more real than I had ever seen her. Timothy leaned forward. How would you feel about managing this place? He asked casually. Laura blinked, her eyes widening. What? You've worked every position, earned the respect of the staff. The current manager is moving to our new location in Milwaukee. The job's yours if you want it. Laura looked at us, clearly overwhelmed. But why? After everything, I smiled softly. Because you proved us wrong. We thought you couldn't change, that you'd always be the person who cared more about status than substance. But look at you now. Her eyes filled with tears. I was awful to both of you. I let money and status blind me to what really matters. Timothy nodded. And now? Laura took a deep breath, then smiled. A real, genuine smile. Now, I finally see what matters. I know now that what really matters is who people are, not what they own or what they do for a living, Laura said, wiping her eyes. She let out a small, shaky laugh. I'm actually proud to be a server now. Proud of what I've learned. Proud of what I can do. That night, as Timothy and I walked home, he squeezed my hand. Your sister finally found her way. I smiled. Our way, I corrected. The hard way. The honest way. Timothy chuckled. Think she's ready for the family reunion next month? When everyone finds out she's managing one of our restaurants. I laughed, picturing Laura standing at the fancy gathering, probably wearing her Cuban restaurant uniform, unbothered by the judgment of the people who once admired her for all the wrong reasons. I think she's finally ready to be herself, no matter what anyone thinks. And that, more than anything else, was the greatest victory. Not the big reveal at our wedding. Not the moment she realized she had been wrong. Not even watching her struggle and learn from her mistakes. The greatest victory was seeing my sister finally discover who she truly was, beneath all the designer labels and social climbing. Because sometimes, the best kind of revenge isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about helping them become a better person. Laura's journey from a judgmental socialite to a hardworking restaurant manager was proof that people can change if they're given the right opportunity and the motivation to grow. As for Timothy and me, we continued living simply, working hard, and remembering that true wealth isn't measured by what you own, it's measured by who you are and how you treat others. And that's a lesson worth more than all the Cuban billions combined.